Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. A month or so ago, I don't know, maybe two, while I was a guest on the reality show on the Ayn Rand Center UK, we discussed an article about Stoicism by Dr. Aaron Smith from the Ayn Rand Institute. I thought it was a well-written article, and I thought the topic was fascinating. So I decided to give him an email and see if he'd respond and get him on the show. He did, and I have him here, and I'm very excited about it. He is a fellow and instructor at the Ayn Rand Institute, and he received his PhD in philosophy from Johns Hopkins University. Aaron Smith, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Michael. Glad to be here.
So I guess the first thing is, who were the Stoics and what did they teach? The basics.
Yeah. So the Stoics were a group of philosophers in ancient Greece. So they flourished anywhere from the 3rd century BC to the 3rd century, no, I shouldn't say, well, about the 3rd century AD. So it's about a 600-year period. It was founded by a guy named Zeno and around 300 BC. So this is about, just for context, this is about 24, 25 years after the death of Aristotle.
Oh, quick question.
Yeah.
The Zeno that founded Stoicism is not Zeno of Elea with the arrow paradox or whatever.
The paradoxes
right?
And stuff.
Yeah.
Right. No, that's Zeno of Elea. This is Zeno of Citium.
Okay.
He's coming from Cyprus. He's a merchant, and he wound up in Athens, allegedly shipwrecked, and lost his fortune, allegedly. We don't really know for sure about that. But when he started up in Athens, and he attended some lectures by the current head of the Plato's Academy. Plato has been long dead, and he came across a guy named Crates, who was a member of what they call the Cynic school. It's coming out of one of Socrates' pupils. And this guy and their perspective had a big impact on Zeno. So the Cynics held that virtue is the only good. It's the only good moral virtue. And that virtue is sufficient for happiness. So literally all you need to have everything worth having in life and to have happiness is a virtuous character. Everything else they disdained, everything conventionally valued, money, health, wealth, good looks, and so on. And they were very disdainful of the many things that people would regard as the good things in life, so to speak. And a change that Zeno made was that he didn't actively disdain all those things, but he did maintain the view that they're indifferent, i.e. irrelevant to your happiness. They're irrelevant to your well-being. And so that all you really need to secure in life is virtue, the internal state of your character. And that's your main concern. So you can, the promise there is that you can have a good, smoothly flowing life, free from all the frustrations, anxieties, inner suffering, inner torment and turmoil that most people have, the desires they have for all sorts of things. And you can be free of all that and live a smoothly flowing life, a good life, according to the Stoics, if you only learn to value in the right way, value the right things, namely virtue, and to have the proper value estimate of all the rest of the things. They should be indifferent to your happiness. And so you shouldn't be bound up, too concerned, not much concerned at all with those kinds of things that most of us spend our lives going after, trying to secure and maintain. So it had a kind of, you can be free of a lot of the worries, anxieties, and sufferings that most people have. Do you want to be more free of that kind of stuff, Michael? I mean, yeah, I think that'd be good. Yeah,
wonderful.
Why not? And the idea was that it puts you in more, this was the claim, that it puts you in more control of your own happiness, your own inner state. And as a result, you can secure a good life no matter what fate or life for other people throw at you.
Are there any
it's
similarities?
A kind of internal inner security. No, sorry, go ahead.
Are there any similarities? It sounds similar to me to Buddhism.
Yeah, I mean, there's the notion of there are dissimilarities as well, but I mean the major similarity that jumps out is the idea of non-attachment, about becoming I mean, the idea that, going back to the Buddha himself, right, is that, why do we suffer? We suffer because we desire things. And if you can eliminate desire, I mean, this is my layman's pop
Yeah.
understanding of Buddhism. I know a little bit more than pop, but it's not much. But the idea, but this is frequently brought up in this context, is that if you can stop desiring things, wanting to have them, longing for them, and so on, you'll stop suffering. Really, internally, you'll stop suffering because you'll have everything you need to have, and you won't be longing for things you don't have. And so there's an aspect, there's a heavy aspect of that, or an element of that in Stoicism, is that the more you can detach yourself from the kinds of things that you and I probably think are important in life. In addition, I mean, character is really important, virtue is really important, and Objectivism makes a big deal out of that. So it's not
Yeah.
like virtue is just one among many, like a virtue, and then you got a cell phone, and like they're not on a level, right? So virtue is central. But the more you can become detached from things, not attached, if I put it like, oh wait, it's not that you can't care about them at all, but you shouldn't care too much about them. Whether the outcomes of your actions, like whether you get that job, whether you get that girlfriend, whether your car gets smashed up or not, like these are things you should not worry too much about.
Most
You'll just be
people, I would think that most people, their sort of familiarity with Stoicism goes about as far as seeing Marcus Aurelius in the movie Gladiator, with Russell Crowe. But it seems to be it's I don't know if it's made a comeback or a resurgence, but it seems like it's out there right now as almost like a fad, right?
Mhm.
I don't know if that's the right word, but it captures it better than anything else I could think of at the moment. Who are the people that are bringing this up, and why? Well, what is the reason? What is the allure? What are they offering to people with this?
Well, a couple of different things. If you look at the people that are kind of got this reemergence of Stoicism sort of reemerging, if you got this sort of back into the public light, there was a 2009 book. Do I have that somewhere over here? Maybe, by William Irvine. He's a philosophy professor. The Ancient Art of Stoic Joy, I think it was called. There's not much joy in the book for sure, but it kind of brought back Stoicism as that, like, this is a philosophy of life that you could adopt. And here it offers all sorts of techniques for managing your emotions, for reducing suffering in your life, for kind of minimizing the things you care about, and you can actually adopt this. That was in 2009. And then I don't remember the dates, 2014. I don't remember the dates, so don't quote me. But Ryan Holiday started publishing his books. I think it was Ego is the Enemy, where he draws on Stoic writings and so on. And then there's the Daily Stoic. So Ryan Holiday, he's a kind of ex-marketing executive, sort of turned Stoic popularizer in effect. And so he has popular websites and blogs and Facebook groups and all sorts of things that offer Stoicism as a kind of a set of life hacks, techniques, principles that you can use to live better, be more focused. It's more positive oriented, like self-improvement. So it's the big waves that it's making is more in the waves isn't the right word. Its popularity is as a result of the self-help sphere. So the extent to which people think, oh, I can, improve my life by reading Marcus Aurelius or reading some of these Stoic works. And so most people are looking at it for self-improvement reasons. And, what Stoicism as a philosophy offers, in that area is minimize the number of things you worry about, concern yourself with your character almost exclusively, and embrace whatever happens to you with equanimity. And that's, I mean, for some people, they find that appealing. I'll tell you two things that I think are valid and valuable in what the Stoics are offering and are legitimately capturing people in effect. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean, just like, it's appealing. And these are elements that you can find in Objectivism too, but they're on a very different basis in Objectivism. But one, that you need some kind of philosophic guidance. You need some kind of abstract guidance, some sort of framework that helps you put things into perspective a framework you can go back and refer to and thinking like, am I living right? Is this the right way to look at myself and human nature? Is this the right way to look at the world? Is this the right way to view an event that took place? Is it really a tragedy? Is it that bad? Is it good? Do I turn this into turn this obstacle into an opportunity? Like, how do I frame things as I navigate life? And so the importance of philosophy, that you need it and that it helps guide you. That's right. And the Stoics made a big deal out of that. And also the idea that you have to be careful about what you value and to value the right kinds of things. Because if you're valuing the wrong kinds of things, you're also kind of desiring the wrong kinds of things, spending your time going after the wrong kinds of things, the kind of things that can derail you in life. And, Objectivism tells people that all the time. It's like, a lot of things you value, you shouldn't be valuing. And a lot of the things that you ought to be valuing, you're not valuing or not valuing properly or not enough or not in the right way. And so you need philosophy. You got to learn to value correctly. And you need to figure out what kinds of things are up to you and what kinds of things are not up to you. What kind of things are under your control and what kind of things are not under your control. Because your perspective on that impacts what you can expect of yourself, what you can hold yourself responsible for, or think you can actually go out and change. Is it just part of who I am and I can't change that? Or is this an aspect of my character that I can work to change? So it's figuring out what you can control and what you can't, and then acting accordingly and judging accordingly. And so I think those are elements that people are, that's useful advice. Yeah, I should think about that, right? Because you should think about that. Like those are important things that they're raising and highlighting and making, central to what their perspective and their guidance is. What they have to say about that, I've been very critical about. A lot of the things they actually tell you about what is up to you and what is not, and what to value and what not to value. I disagree with a lot of what they say. I disagree with them fundamentally on what they have to say on those points. But the fact that they're raising those and saying you should care about these issues, that's good. That's important, and you should.
I think the first time I ever heard of Stoicism, I read a book. I think it was called The Stoics, but it didn't make much of an impact. I didn't know much philosophy back then. So while I'm reading the words, it's like, once you learn more and more about a subject, then you can go back and read it and understand it better. But initially, the terminology they're using meant nothing. But my first real introduction to Stoicism was when I got into reading about cognitive behavioral therapy. And they referenced Epictetus, and I'm probably butchering the name, but whatever.
Epictetus,
Epictetus. And there's a quote from him, something about people are not upset by things, but about how they think about things, or some such thing as that. And the message to me was that by changing my thinking, I could alter my emotional reactions to things. Now, this, I got it from cognitive behavioral therapy, the Stoics, Dr. Nathaniel Branden's book, The Psychology of Self-Esteem, talked about it. Ayn Rand, of course, talked about it. So it was kind of a confirmation and a little bit of advice on how to do it, how to start altering my thinking through the cognitive behavioral therapy. But I thought that's a wonderful thing. I ended up reading the end, again, I'm going to butcher it, the Enchiridion or Enchiridion. I've also read, the Meditations of Marcus Aurelius, and they've got, from what I can tell, and I'm not, I've never taken formal philosophy courses, so I may get it wrong, but they have basically almost a deistic concept of God. They emphasize reason, but they also believe in determinism, and I don't know how those two things go. And then when you talk about by changing your thoughts, you change your emotions. But if you have determinism, then how are you supposed to do that? And I'm wondering if you could elaborate on these things. First of all, am I right in what I'm saying? And if so, if you could elaborate on their concept of God, their concept of reason, and their concept of thought control, I guess, for lack of a better phrase.
Yeah. So, let's take these in order. So the first one was about changing your thoughts to change your emotional state. Yeah, that's true. And that's valuable. And this is going back to Aristotle, actually. I mean, Aristotle's the one. Plato, Aristotle's teacher, held more that often your emotions and desires and so on were kind of at odds with reason, and that they were a distinct motivational source within you, and that they could be at odds with your thinking or your reason. And so there wasn't so much an issue about getting them in harmony with each other. It's about beating the one down so that reason can rule.
Call them passions, right? Your emotions, passions.
Yeah, we can call them passions.
It's
Yeah.
almost like a Freudian thing, right? Where the it is competing with the ego, but he just had it in reasons competing with emotion.
Yeah, reason is competing with for Plato, reason is competing with some of the kind of emotions that are related to things like anger and indignation and so on. And then also with another distinct set of things, which he thinks of as like just desires, like appetites. He puts it like, food, sex, that sort of thing. And Aristotle was much more of the view that, if you can bring harmony between your emotions and reason. And he realized that the kind of emotions you experience come as a result of the kind of value judgments you have. But he observed it, noted it as a theoretician, but he didn't make a big deal out of that in his philosophy. The Stoics do, or at least they eventually did. And they thought, no, this is a life management principle. By the time you get to Epictetus, like, no, this is a really important principle for managing your life. We're suffering, we have frustrations, we have anger, all sorts of things that are messing up our lives, or at least making us feel worse in our life. But we can have some sort of impact on that, right? Because if we feel a certain emotion because we make certain kinds of judgments. If a dog is running after me, like a big Doberman's running after me, and if I judge that I'm in danger, I'm going to experience something like fear. If I judge that, oh, that's my pet dog, I might experience something like joy or elation or whatever it is. And so they thought, yeah, so if we can change our judgments, we can have control over our emotional state. And that seems kind of like empowering, right? I mean, that's how I experienced it. I learned this from Ayn Rand. So I read Ayn Rand before I read Stoics. And so, I learned that, the emotions have cognitive roots, that they're based on your judgments and value premises and so on. And I thought, wow, that's actually helpful. You can have some impact or control over your emotional life. Wow, I didn't know that. That didn't occur to me. And I thought that was very empowering. And I think many people who are learning it from the Stoics are finding the same thing. That, wow, this is helpful. And this is what you're finding that gets into cognitive behavioral therapy. It's a similar kind of principle. But the point you made about determinism, I think, is important. I think it's crucial. Because one of the points I made in this article, I think this is the one you're talking about, called The False Promise of Stoicism.
Yeah.
Whereas I made a certain kind of criticism of the Stoics where, on the one hand, they're staunch moralists. So they take morality seriously. They think they take virtue seriously. They'll tell you, Michael, you're living your life wrong. You need to change, man. You need to value different things. You're valuing all the wrong things. If you change the way you value things, if you change the kind of value judgments you have about things, you can get in a better position in life and, have a better life. And yet at the same time, they are determinists. And so it's like, well, so the point I made is, well, look, if nothing is up to you, what's the difference between making the distinction between what's up to us and what's not up to us? Nothing's up to us. They have a technical answer to that question. It's not a gotcha. They have an answer to that, though I don't think it works. And if you don't have the kind of control over your reason that you do, how is that empowering, right? And I think the problem is intractable. Like, it's like you can't solve it. And there's an interesting book by Donald Robertson called Stoicism and the Art of Happiness. And he's in this chapter, he's talking about determinism and so on, and he writes, and I think this highlights this. I'm surprised many people shy away from this point. He doesn't. He says, for the Stoics, he says, quote, fate, they think everything's fated. Everything that happens is fated to happen exactly as it does. It's all ultimately governed, by God and so on. He says, quote, fate works through us so that even if there are things in life that seem to require great effort on our part to achieve, whether or not we make the effort is fated along with the outcome. You're reading these words, according to the Stoics, because causal necessity has brought you to this specific point. What happens next will depend, in part, on what you choose to do next, because you're a tiny but essential cog in the vast machinery of the universe. However, your choices themselves are the consequences of a massive string of causation set in motion countless billions of years before you were even born, at the beginning of the universe, close quote. And it's sort of like, yeah, okay, a lot of people just shy away from that, like, because it's not very empowering to tell somebody that. Whereas you say, like, you can take control of your life, Michael. I mean, just, control your judgments. You can control your reactions, value the right things. In other words, have the right value estimates of things. And then you can orient yourself properly in life and live a better life. But that seems to depend on the idea that you have that power, that you have the causal power to direct and initiate your thoughts and your thinking and your judgments and so on. Yeah. So, I mean, I think I think it's a fundamental problem with that perspective. And it was realized in the ancient Greek world. I mean, the Epicureans were always criticizing him for that sort of perspective. And Alexander of Aphrodisias, he's a late kind of Aristotelian philosopher, has a long book, basically a book addressing all sorts of arguments that the Stoics have for this, and arguing against them. So it's not just my argument, it's a kind of a common view. And we can talk about I mean, if you're curious, I mean, we can talk about the kind of how they thought they could get out of that.
Sure.
Because they weren't really defending free will, like as we would think of free will. They were trying to defend the idea of moral responsibility. And they wanted to have moral responsibility and at the same time determinism. So that's their version of this. And so if you think about your dog digs up a plant in your backyard in the garden or something, digs up your rose bush. Well, the sense in which the dog is responsible for that, not the deer. The deer actually didn't dig it up. It's like causally, it was not responsible for the fact that your rose bush got dug up. It was your dog. Now, you and I wouldn't regard the dog as morally responsible, as if he had some sort of choice in the matter and he was deliberating as I'm going to get in trouble. I don't know. Maybe they deliberate somehow. I don't know. But there's a sense in which, yeah, the dog's responsible for that act. And yet, if you imagine him as being determined to act that way, you still hold him responsible for that. That's why you put him back in the house. Bad dog. And so they were trying to say that you don't need a notion of free will to have moral responsibility. You just need to have actions that are identifiable as the result of your choices. So if you made certain choices, you have to sleep in that bed, so to speak, right? What do they say? You have to sleep. I don't know. There's an expression. And so you can identify that this person is responsible for this action because it happens as the result of his choices and as a result of his character. If you had a different character and made different choices, you would have taken different actions. And so they're trying to say that's all you need for moral responsibility. Not that they use moral responsibility as there's a separate word moral there. It was just sort of you're responsible for it.
Yeah, it seems ridiculous to me. I just did an interview the other day about free will versus determinism, where I had somebody on my show, and then somebody else watched that and asked me to go on their show and talk about it. And it just seems like what determinists in that vein do is they're not as honest about it as the guy that you quoted before. I don't remember his name. Is they smuggle in choice, like to say all it requires is that you're responsible for the choices, and if you are, well, then you have moral responsibility or whatever's this thing. But all those choices would be determined as well, and so would my character, and so would the consequences, and so would your judgment of it, and the entire scene. I mean, literally everything would be determined. So no, I mean, it just doesn't. It's completely devoid of meaning. And the bottom line is, in life, we have to make choices. Even somebody who says I'm a determinist feels they're making choices. They don't just sit there and say, okay, something's going to make me go here. I remember years ago, I got into this a thought loop in my head about free will versus determinism, and I couldn't get out. I mean, it just drove me crazy for maybe months. And I just couldn't, because either way I went with it, it didn't make sense. And then finally a guy said to me, he said, well, make a choice and decide which way you're going to go. And it was meant as a joke, but ultimately it just occurred to me that I have to make choices. I've got to decide. There's no getting around it. And the moralist of the Stoic persuasion, when they're giving moral advice, whether they admit it or not, they're assuming that they're free to do so, or that you're free to accept it or not, when reality is you're not. I've heard people say, for instance, even if determinism is real, that doesn't mean we can't hold people accountable for their decisions, because they're still putting
Yeah,
people at risk.
same.
Yeah, it's
Yeah,
the same. But okay, well, you would have no choice but to, or but not to. You're assuming that
correct.
you have the freedom to choose what to do in relation to them. So the whole thing just sort of fails, in my view, and it vastly undercuts this modern emphasis on Stoicism or the modern teachings, unless they're diverting from it in some way, which it seems that they are from the article. I haven't read any of the modern Ryan Holiday stuff or anything like that, but from what your article, it seems that they're evading the sort of the roots of Stoicism and determinism and God and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think a lot of the guidance, like if you think about like the self-help guidance, the kind of stuff where you could legitimately think, yeah, this is pretty decent guidance. It's assuming that you have volition. I mean, that you're assuming that you have free will. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense. About the issue about whether it's honest or not, I think that free will is one of the most free will, volition, the phenomenon of choice, right, is incredibly difficult to conceptualize. So it's one thing to say, I experience myself as making choices. Fair enough. I think you do. I think you directly experience it. I think it's observable. It's directly by introspection. You observe yourself making choices, deliberating, and so on. And yet, as a philosopher, whether it's the Stoics or Aristotle or Ayn Rand, you have to have. So what's immediately available to you is the phenomenon of choice. And what you require, though, if you're a philosopher, is a theory of free will, and that's hard. That's what people have been struggling with for centuries. You read David Hume, or you read Descartes, or you read somebody like Kant. They're all very different perspectives on how to try to integrate. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to integrate an observed phenomenon of choice with a theory of causation and an awareness that some other things don't function by choice. And the more and more you started to get a mechanistic kind of worldview about, atoms and how things work, and it's a sort of like, well, it seems like you're in a deterministic system, like all this stuff doesn't operate by choice. We can even measure like down to the minute when a comet will arrive, 300 years later or something like that. It's a clockwork world. And the more that perspective started to be there, so how do you integrate this phenomenon of choice that we observe in our own consciousness? And then when you're trying to integrate that so how do those two relate? Does it just feel like we're choosing, but it's just another clockwork sort of mechanism, so to speak, that we just don't yet understand fully? And for some people, that seemed more attractive, because I was like, how can this be like this weird outlier? I threw the word in weird, but how can this be this seeming outlier? And then people started to think, you know what, I bet this is just a holdover for this whole Christian mystic kind of conception of the soul. It's this otherworldly thing that's embodied into the bodies of things in the world, and it's supposed to operate by its own special rules, and we need to get rid of that sort of mystical sort of perspective and be more scientific and hard-headed and so on. And people started to have much greater suspicion for the notion of free will, because of a certain kind of conception of causality that they held that didn't integrate with the phenomenon of choice being genuine or being real. And they didn't know how to put it together. Or at least they put it this way. They looked at those and thought, you can't integrate these two. You got to throw out one. And yet science seems to be doing pretty well on the supposition that things just function exactly as they do because they have to. And let's throw out free will, because that seems like the harder one to explain, the harder one. And yet we observe it. And yet that's why you get this idea of free will is an illusion. An illusion is an illusion is something you perceive in a certain kind of way. It's something you actually experience. And then you have to go, oh, like, well, how do I explain that? Because I actually experienced it. is the idea. If you didn't have any illusion, there would be nothing to talk about, but it was, no, we have this experience of choice. So I think it's very hard to conceptualize and to integrate a general notion of causation with how do you think about volition. And the options we're often given is everything's deterministic, free will is just an illusion, there's just no such thing. Or you have the idea that free will and determinism are compatible. If you can, define freedom in such a way that it's compatible with determinism, and you have to, because basically that view says determinism is true. So what choice must be is it occurs deterministically, and yet choice is real. Or the idea is free will is magic. You have free will, and it functions non-causally, acausally. It just happens, and you have some special weird mystic power. And those are often how the options are presented to us. And if those are the options, most philosophers today pick determinism, free will is an illusion, or more often than not, the sort of compatibilist view that they have a conception of what choice is, but it's a deterministic conception of what choice is. And so I just want to say that that's a tough problem to solve. I mean, you got a lot of brilliant minds that have been thinking about that problem. And you see the way Thomas Hobbes comes about it. You see the way David Hume comes about it. These are smart guys. And at the same time, it's the views that they wind up with are not in favor of free will. And so I'll say that.
How do you solve it?
Well, I didn't solve it, so I thought, and I wouldn't have been able to solve it. But I agree with the way Rand solves the problem. I mean, this is a longer issue now. We're getting away from Stoicism, but so on the one hand, she thinks that the phenomenon of choice, that's what you're trying to conceptualize as free will or volition or whatever. It's the phenomenon of choice. And she isolates what she thinks is the essence of that, what it boils down to. It's the power, the causal power, not acausal, not contra-causal, but the causal power to initiate and sustain a cognitive process. The process to think or not to think is up to you, the way she would put it. And as a result, the results of that thinking, things like your emotional state and so on, like that's not directly under your power, but it comes as a result of this. And your actions are the results of your thinking and non-thinking and your judgments and choices and so on. But that's something that's under your power. And she thinks on the other hand that the denial of free will, to say that you don't have that power, is incoherent. I mean, for someone to maintain the truth of a theory, like I got it right, and to advocate determinism and say I'm in the right and you're in the wrong, I think it's literally incoherent, because it means I have no causal power at all over the choices that I make, over the judgments that I make, over what sounds or strikes me as plausible or coherent or incoherent. I have no control over my cognitive processes, but mine reached the right conclusions and yours didn't. No, you'd be in the position where I'm one apple and you're another apple, and I fall off the tree and you stay on the branch.
Right.
Which one of us is right? It's like, it's not just there's no such thing as right or wrong or justified or unjustified or objective or non-objective. No, it's you function precisely how you had to function, and I function precisely as I had to function. So they have to find some way you have to have an ability to impact the result in some way. You have to have some power to, reflect on your thoughts and then maybe change them. And so what gets smuggled in Stoicism is this, well, smuggled in sounds, I don't want to make that sound overly negative, but what they need to have, and what many of the practitioners of Stoicism will advocate, is that this power to reflect on our judgments and reflect on our thoughts is kind of this recursive thing. It gives us the ability to change them, to consider them and change them. But then you can ask the question, do you have control over that? Or does that just happen or not happen? And so I think the way to make the theory coherent is to make it incoherent. So if you make it fit that model, like your choice to reflect on your thoughts and to consider changing them. If that's not up to you, and that just happens as a deterministic process, then there might be some sort of recursive feedback mechanism, but you don't have any control over it. It might have this
Right.
different output, like a different kinds of actions if it happens or if it doesn't happen, but you can't, if you can't weigh in on that, it's just another deterministic feature, and you don't have any volitional control over your actions. So I think in the end, it's just incoherent, but it's a hard problem, and so it's hard for me to blame. I mean, it's easy from a certain kind of perspective. Yeah, that doesn't make any sense, and I think it doesn't. But it's the more you study this problem and how people grapple with them across the history of philosophy, the more I think respect you have for the difficulty of the problem and the
Oh,
challenge.
maybe wasn't clear on what I meant. I meant the guy that you quoted was
Hmm.
honest in the sense that if determinism is true, it's true all the way down the line. In the sense that
Yeah, I mean, how integrated of a view this guy has on that phenomenon, I'm not sure. But like,
well,
take
that's true.
Massimo Pigliucci. I mean, he's a philosopher of science, and he's written some stuff against my stuff, and I've written some stuff against his stuff. But he wrote an article sort of challenging my article, The False Promise of Stoicism. He wrote this on his blog. It was called something like "Epic Battles in Practical Ethics: Stoicism versus Objectivism" or something like that. And he basically argues like what Smith is arguing is free will is basically magic in the end. That's his position has to boil down to that, because he's criticizing us for for being determinists, and yet what he wants, what Smith wants, seems to be something like it's magic, it's acausal, it just whatever. And so I wrote an article, defending this position about volition and free will, and making the case that like if you don't have this power, this recursive power to consider one's thoughts, to change them if you think that they're wrong, to impact that process, there's no way that there's a you sort of coming into the process.
Right.
There's no way to have free will, and yet he believes in this somehow, this recursive process. Like that's the power we have. Volition is this issue of the ability to think about and to reflect on our ideas and change them for the better. And I'm like, yeah, but you can't. You're saying they don't have that power.
So
Or to have that power, you'd have to get out of a deterministic view. But then there's a lot of confusions about determinism. Some people use the term determinism just to mean things function by cause and effect. But then their conception of cause and effect is deterministic. So there's so if you're against determinism, you're against cause and effect. You're like, well, hold on, stop. I'm not against cause and effect, for Christ's sake. I mean, causality is universal. Causality simply flows out of the identities of things. Things have certain capacities and powers, certain abilities to do certain kinds of things, and that's how they function. They don't function by magic. They don't function non-causally. So I think 100% universal causation, but that doesn't tell you what causal powers things have. That you have
so
to figure out.
the reason I think that this is important, especially in this context, is because, like you said earlier, the Stoics say that virtue will make you happy, and that's all that matters, is living the virtuous life. The problem is virtue implies choice. It's virtue is commendable because somebody is choosing to do it. Otherwise, it's just like you said, an apple falling from the tree. You don't praise or blame the apple; it just falls from the tree. But one thing I don't know, and I've read, a lot of Stoic stuff. I don't know what virtues that they teach, or what they teach are virtues, or how they arrive at the decision that those are virtues. Do you? I'm sure you know.
Yeah, they're pretty traditional. So these are the sort of four classical Greek virtues that you'll find in Socrates and Plato. It's prudence, if you want to call that practical wisdom, however you want to translate that. Let's call it prudence. What is it? Prudence, temperance, justice, courage, or something like that. It's so temperance is kind of the virtue concerned with knowing when to abstain, knowing how much is too much, and it's a kind of a self-control, typically with regards to the pleasures. Justice is knowledge of, so all of their virtues, it's coming out of Socrates, that virtue is knowledge. So virtue is a certain kind of knowledge. So justice is the knowledge of like how to respond to other people, what's appropriate, and so on. And so it's pretty standard Greek ethics. But the focus has been on knowing what's rationally appropriate in a given situation. Whether it's 4 virtues or you throw in a 5th one or something, but that's what it boils down to. It's knowing what's rational in any given kind of circumstance or set of circumstances or cases. And to that extent, at that abstract of a level, it's similar to Aristotle. Aristotle's virtues, I think, are better, but there are too many of them. Anyway, that's a separate conversation, and that's a throwaway remark. But it's about virtues are about what's rational in a given situation, about knowing what the rational course of action is. And suppose you're faced with some kind of pleasures or temptations, and it's knowing about what's rationally appropriate, a rationally appropriate response to, let's say, pleasures or fears, danger, public office, a bribe, and a given virtue will be, oh, this is the virtue you use for that or whatever. But then a lot depends on why you think a given course of action is the rational one in that context. Like, so you could say temperance is the virtue concerned with knowing what's rational in response to pleasures. But if you have an anti-pleasure view, it's, get rid of them or something like that. And that would be the rational thing, right? If pleasure is bad for you, you should avoid them all, right? So I'm not saying they hold that view, but they are very suspicious of pleasures. But a lot depends on what the framework is, not just because, like, who's against virtue? I'm in favor of virtue. I'm in favor of virtue. I'm in favor of rationally responding to any kind of given situation. So I'm all in favor of reason. But then a lot matters. It's like, what do you think the value of pleasure is? Just as an example. Are you anti-pleasure? Are you pro-pleasure? Are you kind of on the view like, just don't do too much?
It sounds like they don't have, this is one of the things that appealed to me when I first read Ayn Rand, is that she has a criteria that's reality-based on how to arrive at our moral judgments. And that's my life. So I look and I say, does this thing benefit my life long term? Considering all relevant factors that I have access to, will this thing redound to my benefit long term? Life is the standard of value, right? Mm-hmm. Almost all moralists, except for religious moralists who take for their standard the commands of whatever their God supposedly told them, they just posit ethical things like, oh, you should be honest. It's just obvious, be honest, or, work hard, or what was the word, temperance, or be prudent. So to tell somebody, well, you should just be rational without criteria by which to govern that rationality just doesn't get me there. It doesn't do it the way that Objectivist does it. I hope that makes sense. What are your thoughts on what I'm saying?
Yeah, it doesn't do it without saying more. So if you just said it's like an undergraduate philosophy professor, and he said that when he was at his graduation ceremony, someone came to give the commencement speech, or maybe the dean would always come up in front of the students. And he said something like this as they're about to finish the commencement: "Go out there and do what's right," or something like that. Remember, he was telling me like that's not actually very helpful. I mean, do what's right. It's like, well, what's right? And there's all sorts of different conceptions of how to think about, what's right. Same with be rational. Does that just mean, don't run around like a madman and, use logic or something? It's like, well, yeah, but a lot of that depends on what you think is the human nature, what you think of the nature of the world, what you think is actually valuable, and then that will color what you think is rational to do. And so, I mean, the Stoic, you asked about a standard. And the Stoics do have more to say about that. But once you start filling in the details, you can start to see, I can see why they would think of that this is the rational course of action, that this would be irrational. I'll give you an example. The Stoics advocated basically getting rid of the passions. This doesn't mean being literally non-emotional completely. It just means that most of your emotions are irrational, they think. Not because they come from the irrational element of you like Plato, but they're irrational because they're improper responses to the world. So think about anger. Suppose someone insults me and I get angry. What's actually going on there? I've judged that I've been wronged, I've been harmed in some way. And as a result, I feel a desire to lash out. The Stoic view is you haven't been harmed. The only harm that you can actually suffer in life, the only bad thing, is if you start becoming morally corrupt. Vice is the only bad. Virtue is the only good. What happened to you is some external event that can neither harm you nor hurt you. So your judgment's just irrational. The judgment that you've been harmed, that's underlying the experience of anger, is misguided. And so the view is, yeah, you shouldn't be feeling anger. Now you might, in a moment of unclarity or something, like lose perspective and get angry, and then realize, no, that I wasn't actually harmed. Somebody said some things, but those don't actually harm me. There's no reason for me to get upset. And so that you can start to get so you see how they can think of that as it's irrational to experience anger. And same with other things like fear. There are many things that most of our emotions, they think that are irrational because of the value judgments that underlie them are wrong. If you really can internalize the idea that your own virtue is the only thing that's good, and the vice, your own, moral corruption in effect, is the only thing that's bad, and everything else is value neutral, you won't have the kinds of emotions that you do toward things. Your daughter gets hit by a truck. Have you been harmed? No. Can that detract from your happiness on their view? No. Do you still have everything worth having? Yes. You can accept it with equanimity and not be hurt. Now they'll say, yeah, but you are human and you'll probably feel something like that. But it's something to overcome. It's something to ultimately realize, look, I knew she was mortal. Now, they're not saying don't care about your kids, but there's a kind of perspective in which if you can get yourself to the point where that's how you feel when something like that happens, I think you've basically detached yourself so much that it's sort of, you've lost a connection to your value.
Yeah, it sounds like total indifference.
Yeah. And because that's what you would need to get rid of that passion of grief. I mean, grief is something you shouldn't experience. You should get rid of. It might be natural that it occurs to you because you're not a Stoic sage yet. You're not the ideal Stoic wise man yet. But once you do, you won't experience grief. You'll take it as it comes. And technically, since their view is that everything that happens in the world is the product of a benevolent God. I mean, it's sort of, everything that happens for the best. And so this was sent by God for you. And ultimately redounds to the good of the whole. And so you should, not look on that as a negative event. So they have these techniques for dealing with that kind of thing. Well, on the one hand, you can say, God is sending me a challenge so I can exercise my moral muscle and show how virtuous I am and not be concerned about it and so on. Or it's, I was granted this child for a while, but it was never mine. It'll be absorbed back into the universe like everything else. And I had it for a while and now it's gone. I haven't lost anything. It wasn't mine. There's ways of telling them, but a lot of this is about, and I think it's one of the major appeals of Stoicism. It's a mechanism. It's a way of coping. It's a way of coping with pain, loss, frustration, suffering. I belong to some Facebook groups for Stoicism and some little Reddit groups and stuff. Not super active or anything in those, but it's interesting to watch the flow of what people are talking about. My girlfriend just left me. What's the proper Stoic response? My dog, I had to put down my dog. He was really sick and I'm really grief stricken and I know I shouldn't be. And I'm trying to find a way to manage that pain. And what does Stoicism have to offer me? It's a litany of things like this. It's people come with pain and they were looking for relief. And they get all sorts of guidance from Stoicism about that. I mean, Epictetus called his school a hospital, and people come here, in effect, soul sick. And I'm giving them a perspective on themselves and on the world and on their life that can reduce that suffering. And I think a lot of people are going to it for that reason. And I don't think that's a bad reason, right? It's like, I don't want to suffer. And if
Sure.
I'm suffering inordinately or bad, I'm looking for relief, whether it's Tylenol or it's philosophic conversation or therapy or like whatever. So it's like, it's right to want some kind of belief. But I think that to counsel detachment and to sort of reframing of what you care about. Sometimes you should reframe what you care about, because sometimes you care wrongly about certain kinds of things.
Sure.
But I think the counsel is be more detached, take things as they come, um, pushes people to be less connected with what makes life worth living. Somebody asked me in a different forum, somebody asked me about, is there a kind of rational reason to, what did he put it? Want to hang on to life? And I thought, geez, I hope that wasn't an existential question. But I thought, well, yeah, I mean, if there's any value in life and in living, it's the experience of attachment to your values. If you didn't care, yeah, maybe this happens, maybe it doesn't. Like literally, it doesn't matter to me. Like nothing would matter to you if your life
Right.
doesn't matter. If you, it's like, so it's the experience of values, whether it's the taste of cherries or an invigorating walk, or you see your article in print, or whatever it is. I mean, there's a whole list of things that it's the experience of value attachment, and that's your attachment to the world.
You know,
Values, your valuing is your attachment to the world, and it's the reason, it's what makes life worth living. And the more and more you start counseling people to be less attached. Now you can package it in a way that makes it sound bad, like, oh, if I don't get that job, oh, my life is not worth anything. No, that's an irrational attachment.
right.
Your life and your well-being literally doesn't, or your Jaguar got all banged up or something, and it's like, oh, it's the end of the world. It's like, no, it's not the end of the world, and that is an irrational kind of attachment. But I think you should be rationally attached to your values. And rationally doesn't mean, well, if I have them, I don't. If I lose them, they get smashed. That's fine.
It
Not
seems
if you
like
really care about it. Because I can have that attitude. I lost a spoon or something. And I'm like,
who
it's
cares about the
irrelevant to me.
spoon?
Yeah. Right.
So it seems like people are turning toward this modern version of Stoicism for guidance, for help.
Mhm.
And and by no means would I ever try to dissuade anybody from reading Stoicism. I
Oh, no.
read
Yeah,
everything. But it seems to me that in objectivism encompasses all the positive things of Stoicism, meaning the ability to change your thoughts, how that improves your life, how your emotions follow from your thought, that sort of thing. But it avoids the negatives of indifference and determinism. So I just think objectivism would be a much better path, or a much better thing to embrace. Now, obviously, it's not just a matter of putting your arms around it and say, I'm an objectivist now. It takes a lot of study and a lot of thinking. But what would you say to that? Do you think that that's right, that objectivism contains the benefits that come from Stoicism while avoiding the pitfalls?
I think that's basically fair from the following perspective. Um, yeah, you need to think about what's up to you and what's not, what you can control and what you can't. But I think the value of that advice, to get real value out of that advice, not bogus value, like, oh, I guess I don't have to care, right? But real value out of that, you need free will. That's contentious, but I think it's true. And if you read Ayn Rand's essay, The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made, she discusses this issue. She starts out talking about the serenity prayer. What is it? God grant me the serenity to accept the things I can't change, courage to accept the things I can, and wisdom to know the difference, right? She said, aside from the sort of mystical element of that, that's excellent advice. And it's precisely the attitude a rational person must work to achieve and sort of internalize. And then she says, yeah, but to reach that perspective and have a rational view of it, it involves philosophy's deepest metaphysical and moral issues. And then she goes on to talk about what those deep philosophical issues, and those are issues on which she disagrees with Stoicism, but she thinks that orientation is essential. Same with the relationship between reason and emotion. So objectivism and Stoicism do not agree about the relationship between reason and emotion. Fundamentally, because reason is a volitional faculty. Reason operates by choice. And so once you get rid of that, you sort of mess up or misconceptualize the relationship between reason and emotion. Man is a being of self-made soul, as she puts it. And the idea is you form your character. And I say they want to have that, and yet they kind of can't. But there's something right about wanting to have that sort of perspective. And yet, if you eliminate free will, you sort of kill off that sort of relationship. You're a product, not a being of self-made soul. So I think what sounds like empowering guidance, from a certain perspective, it is. If you're implicitly importing free will, then yeah, that can be helpful guidance at some level. But if you don't, you won't have that. And as in terms of standards, I wanted to get back to that because you mentioned it and I forgot to address it. So Objectivism says that man's life is the standard. The terms, methods, conditions, and so on that are required for the life of a rational being over the course of his lifespan. And that's something that you have to figure out and determine, like, what is that standard? That's a complex standard, and how to meet it, which is basically what ethical guidance on her view is about, how to meet that standard fully. Like, what kinds of virtues do you need to practice? What kind of values do you need to pursue? If life is the goal, and life as a human being, as a conceptual being over the course of his life, thinking long range and so on, what does man need? For the Stoics, they have a kind of standard. And I would put it, I was thinking about this, I was giving a talk at OCON, our summer conference, about this. I was thinking, well, what is their standard? And I would put it as, it's that which is in agreement with nature. I think that's the most simplest way to put it for them. So if you look at their sort of worldview, it's they have a kind of pantheistic worldview. So God is the cosmos is God, and his sort of reason, in effect, permeates everything in various kinds of forms, and everything is fated to be as it is, and your job is to comply with that. So to get in agreement with that, and ethics is a form of that. So this guy Hippolytus, he's a kind of first century bishop who wrote a piece, I think it was called "Against the Heresies" or something like that. And he's a source for lots of material on ancient philosophers, Stoics included. And he tells a story that Chrysippus allegedly conveyed or had. He said that, like, you're like a dog tied like by a leash to a moving cart in life. You can either choose to walk serenely with the cart, or you can dig your heels in and fight against the cart and get pulled the same way. So the universe will pull you into the same direction. What's going to happen is going to happen, but you can choose to comply with it. Cheerfully and serenely comply with it and walk with fate and not against it. And that's one of the ways of, like, you're living in agreement with nature, with your own nature and the nature of the world around you. And so a lot of you thinking about ethical guidance is how to think of myself as being in compliance with the nature of the world around me. But for then you have to identify, well, what is the nature of the world around me? Well, everything is fated to be as it is. Reason is my distinctive faculty. It's my element of God within me. So why be rational? Not to be John Galt. It's like, why to be rational? It's because God, this is my element of the divine within me, and I should live according to that. It's my way of, complying with my divine, the nature of the divine within me. So it's ultimately, like, it's about compliance with or agreement with the world. I think so. What is out of agreement with the world or out of compliance with the world is the standard, I think, for what they think of as valuable.
Yeah, I don't know what it could possibly mean. Like, it's when people say stuff like that, in compliance with nature or in harmony, I don't know what they're talking about. When I look at nature apart from humans, it doesn't look all that harmonious in the sense of anything. I mean, I guess there could be an overall harmony in sort of with ecological systems and whatnot. But if you watch a lion devouring an antelope, It's not like I say, "Oh, look at the harmony there." It's just beautiful. I'd like to be
Well,
in
harmony
accordance with
doesn't
that.
mean like, we're all holding hands, but so they are acting precisely as nature intends them to act. This is exactly what harmony looks like, the lion devouring the gazelle. So, but just you could just think about it this way. Do you want to act contrary to your own nature or in compliance with your own nature as a human being? Well, compliance sounds like you're following rules, but that's not. But no, I want to act in harmony with my nature. If I'm a rational being, I need to acknowledge that, take that into account, and function that way. If I
Yes,
think that, yeah, so if you take the objectivist view, is reason is your only means of knowledge,
I would say
and
it's
that's a metaphysical fact.
impossible. I
It's a
would
metaphysical
say
fact,
I would say
and
it's a
you have to acknowledge
fundamental.
that.
So sorry. I would say it's fundamentally impossible to act outside my nature. I would say it's fundamentally impossible for any entity to act outside its nature.
Well, you can't do things you can't do.
That's what I mean.
There's that. But you can be irrational. A person can be
Sure.
irrational. Can act in ways that are contrary to its own good. And in that sense, you're kind of subverting an important element of your own nature. If reason is your means of gaining knowledge, it's your means of survival, ultimately. It's your means of figuring out what's good for you and what's not. If you're acting in ways that subvert reason and you're evading all sorts of stuff, you're acting on your whims or just following whatever everybody else does, you're in a way you're subverting your survival faculty. And so objectivism's perspective on that would be like, yeah, you're out of harmony with what your actual needs are.
Oh, I would agree with that for
Yeah.
sure.
And so
That's
there's a
for
way
sure.
in which, yeah, so there's a way in which, of a certain level of abstraction, you could say, yeah, I want to acknowledge the nature of nature and my own nature as a human being and live in accordance with that, not in contradiction to it, or not try to live in contradiction to it. Yeah, at that high level of abstraction, sure, but that doesn't mean loving my fate as it's brought down to God and I'm the dog in the cart. That's a particular kind of perspective based on a particular view of what they think the nature of nature is. Um, yeah. So, and what human nature is like.
Okay, Aaron, is there anything that I didn't ask about Stoicism that I should have asked that you think we need to go over? I mean, I know we could go through the
Um,
whole history and every
yeah,
Stoic
yeah.
philosopher,
So
but I mean
I
the
would say,
essentials.
yeah, if people are interested in Stoicism, so speaking to objectivists first, if you're interested in Stoicism, it's worth reading. I think the Stoics are worth reading. I think partly just to get a sense of what they're like, what they stand for. And I think the most approachable book is the Meditations by Marcus Aurelius. I like this new translation, by the way, by Robin Waterfield. It's my favorite translation. It comes really annotated, so there's a lot of explanations and things, and it's easy to read. And what you're reading is the private journal of Marcus Aurelius, the Roman emperor. And he's in that journal, he's kind of, in effect, counseling himself, going over some of the things that he's going to have to deal with the next day, and kind of reflecting on his philosophic principles. He's trying to bring his philosophic principles to bear on his life and the actual real world struggles that he has to deal with. And you're watching someone grapple with life by trying to apply their philosophy, and it's worth reading and it's interesting. So if you're interested in dipping into that, I would start there. If you're more in the audience of people who are interested in Stoicism, interested in Stoicism, and you're wondering, like, what does this Objectivism have to say? There's a couple of articles that I think are worth reading. One is an essay by Ayn Rand. This is available on ARI's website, called "The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made," the one I was talking about that talks about the Serenity Prayer and what you can control and what you can't, and so on. That's worth reading. I think also the essay "Causality versus Duty." Both of these essays are in her book, Philosophy Who Needs It?
That's a
And
great
maybe just
essay.
the essay "Philosophy Who Needs It?" Because partly I've been saying that, both Stoicism and Objectivism take the idea that you need a philosophy, like you need a framework to guide you. And in that essay, "Philosophy Who Needs It," she talks about why that is. And then about what you can and cannot control. I would look at the essay, "The Metaphysical versus the Man-Made." So if you have show notes, you might want to link to that. And if there are people out there just curious about Stoicism in general, if you want a short but concise and accurate academic perspective on the philosophy as a whole, as a system, I would say Brad Inwood's book. This is Oxford did this series called A Very Short Introduction to X, and this is on Stoicism. Yeah. These are not dumbing it down. These are like really well-known scholars who are writing these books. This is a good one. And if you want a sense of what the modern Stoics today are putting out and presenting Stoicism, there's a slender little book by John Sellers. What's it called? Lessons in Stoicism. If you want a short, easy to read way in which Stoicism is presented to kind of the modern world, in again, not like a dumbing down or something.
Yeah,
it's a little bit aimed at a sort of modern audience, but it's not like Ryan Holiday, selling life hacks.
It's not pop culture Stoicism.
No, but it's actually aimed at people today. Not like, here's an ancient system and let's learn about it, but this is the philosophy you should be living by. Right. And so I think it's interesting about this too is the phenomenon of Stoicism is one of the reasons I write about it is what other philosophies are people becoming attached to today? Like as a philosophy, it's a kind of, well, philosophies are kind of dead.
Yeah.
In the ancient world, you could be an Aristotelian or a Platonist or a Stoic or an Epicurean or a Cyrenaic or whatever. Like there were different schools of philosophy, and they involved a different kind of way of living, and you just don't really see that much today. And I think there should be philosophies, but we kind of saw the end of systematic philosophy, in the 20th century. And
that's unfortunate.
I think there's something good though about the fact that people are looking back to philosophy, and I think specifically about looking back to pre-Christian philosophy for something valuable. And yeah, but
okay, where can people find you? Ayn Rand Institute, do you have a blog, a website, something where people can go if they want to read your stuff?
Well, they have there's a page on the Ayn Rand Institute's website where I'm listed. So we have a journal called New Ideal. And if you just look up Aaron Smith, New Ideal, or if you want to put it in the show notes, I'm listed there as one of the authors. We also have what we call an expert page on our website that kind of puts like, these are our kind of in-house intellectuals and so on. And I have a page there. If you just Google Aaron Smith, Ayn Rand Institute, you'll find me on there. Right. I'm all over YouTube and things. But
well, thank you for a very informative discussion. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, Michael.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Remember, I want to hear your comments. Let me know what they are. I find them very helpful. Uh-oh, my mouse isn't working.
Take it with equanimity.
I'm trying. All right. Till next time.